Hello and welcome to another Tabadlab Policy Roundtable. Today's topic of discussion is the federal design of Pakistan and the 18th Amendment. This is, of course, a topic that has gripped many nations all around the world because it goes to the very heart of the organizing principles around which a society decides to come together and be one. It's a particularly interesting and important time for this topic, given many different aspects of public life that tend to be debated whenever there's a crisis, like the COVID-19 crisis. There tends to be an uptick, both in efforts to unite and come together, but also in pointing fingers and assigning blame. What we've seen in terms of the public discourse and the public debate around COVID-19 since the beginning of the crisis is a provincial competition, which for the most part could have been very healthy, but it has repeatedly taken an ugly turn as well, at least for those folks that are invested in a united and coherent national response. Today's purpose of coming together is not necessarily to debate the COVID-19 aspect of the response, but to take out a wider chunk of the conversation and to zoom out and look at the history of the 18th Amendment itself and the current state of federal relations, the current state of interprovincial relations, and the current state of province and center relations. We have a fantastic group, and I'm grateful to all of them for making time, some on very short notice. We're joined by Dr. Arfana Mallah from the University of Sindh. She's a scholar and an academic and has a long-standing set of views on federalism. We're joined by Tariq Khosa. Tariq Saab has been, in 2023, inshallah, he will have completed 50 years of public service, both as a civil servant and as a private individual. Over the last few years, he's currently leading a national effort against organized crime. We're joined by Rafiullah Kakar, who is in fact, the first Oxford Rhodes Scholar from the great province of Balochistan and currently working with the government of Balochistan on the COVID-19 response. We're joined by Dr. Miftah Ismail, who is the former finance minister of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, is a staunch believer in federalism and a member of the Pakistan Muslim League N. And last but definitely not least, we're joined by Salman Akram, who is a lawyer, a constitutional expert, a human rights and freedom activist and advocate, and a very dear friend, as are many today. Thank you for joining us, all of you, and my apologies for that long introduction. I wanted to get started with you, Dr. Arfana. The current debate around the 18th Amendment, if you were innocent, not you, but if one was innocent, it would seem that it's kind of appeared out of nowhere. But perhaps you can give us some guidance as to where the current debate has sprung up from, and what do you think what is behind the fact that this debate has been, in a sense, reignited all of a sudden?
Thank you, Musharraf. Actually, first and foremost thing for all of us is that we are still not principally agreed that Pakistan is a federal state, because there is a clear division of powers in federation. And Pakistan is one of the federation, and federation, a very famous scientist, Immanuel Kant, says, even the nation of devil can form a state as long as they have a constitution. So I believe that Pakistanis are not the nation of devils. They are very innocent human beings, and they can form a very viable and vibrant nation, a vibrant state like Pakistan, because we have a very good constitution. And after a long waiting, finally 18th Amendment has been introduced on the demands of Sindh and the lesser provinces. I can say Punjab is also equally beneficiary of 18th Amendment. 18th Amendment is actually come with the abolition of concurrent list. All are aware in 1973 constitution, there were a concurrent list because some subjects were left undecided. And finally, 18th Amendment came with a set of amendments where all these things were well settled and divided among federations and center. And almost all parties agreed upon this division of power. And every province get their share as long as the different, we all agree with one principle that Pakistan is a state where different ethnic groups, peoples with different linguistic backgrounds are living under the umbrella of federation. And they own this federation, they love this federation. But the problem arises when there is a conflict of division of resources among the federation. And 18th Amendment so far is one of the best amendments that has settled so many issues, so many problems, including the NFC, 7th NFC award, where the financial resources are also slightly, though the little federating units are still not happy, but still they agreed upon this division of resources. So 18th Amendment is not just an amendment that take away the 15(2)(b) power from the president of, because majority of people think that 18th Amendment is just a set of amendments consist of only two things. One is the President of Pakistan give up its power of 15(2)(b), and other one is the NFC award. But it included many a set of little amendments that are very important for the viable federation. So personally, the issue right now arises when in the COVID-19 issue, the provinces of Sindh start impose the lockdown, and the peoples of Sindh, regardless of any urban or rural divide or any kind of divide, supported Sindh government's step that they are happy. There should be a complete lockdown because when we look at around the world, there is no remedy except the lockdown. And instead of debating on the modalities of lockdown, whether federation has every right to disagree with the provinces, they started suddenly that the 18th Amendment is the root cause of this whole conflict. 18th Amendment comes out of blue. There is no need to talk about 18th Amendment right now because under the set of 18th Amendment, federating units are the provinces share the power and they can take the decisions. They can act as a semi-autonomous entities, whatever is the best in their citizens, what is the best in the, and what is in the favor of their citizens. So personally, I feel that there is some centralist lobby in the Pakistan who are not happy with the 18th Amendment, and whenever they feel any kind of crisis, whenever they think that the federating units are not agreeing upon any sort of solution, they bring the 18th Amendment. At this time, we all should have to focus on COVID-19, not on the constitutional amendment, because this is a critical time for all of us. While 18th Amendment, we, the peoples who belong to the smaller federating units, consider it is the only way to share the power, share the resources with the federation. And they think that it is the only way where the federating units have a little autonomy over their resources, over their actions, and they can breathe a fresh air after this 18th Amendment. So we think it is very important amendments, and though there is, we can't say this is the final kind of amendment. Every constitution always have a room for betterment. There is always a room for dialogue. But this is not the time to initiate such important and serious dialogue right now. When the COVID-19 is around, our peoples are dying. We have no policy in hand. We are in conflict with federation. At this time, talking about 18th Amendment, personally, I feel is a dishonest thing. Personally, I feel it is an effort to just roll back the 18th Amendment or somehow again grab the powers given to the devolve very difficulty to the provinces or federating units.
That's you know, I'm not surprised by that position, Dr. Saiba, but I think it's a really interesting and I think a fantastic starting point for our discussion. I want to talk a little bit more about this lobby, those that would like centralized power. And Tariq Saab, you may not be surprised that I will come to you on this, not for any reason other than the fact that oftentimes we have this binary view of what is behind the centralizing instinct. And the binary view is, of course, that all the civilians are all on one side, and they want federalism, and they want provincial and subnational governance, and the military is on the other side. And I often think this is a reductive and dangerously simplistic view, because actually, I think that the centralizing powers or forces in Pakistan are not rooted in Rawalpindi. They're rooted actually in Islamabad, perhaps at the establishment division. I say perhaps only to leave some room for debate. As somebody who spent a lifetime in the service of this country, in an all Pakistan unified grade in the police service of Pakistan, how offended are you by that accusation? And what do you think we can do? What is it that we can do to kind of parse the debate a little more and give some due credit to people who believe that the 18th Amendment went too far?
Musharraf, as a public servant, as a civil servant for more than 4 decades in this service of Pakistan, and also having served in different provinces, I feel the timing of this political bickering is sad. And the entire political leadership, whether of the provinces or the federation, should have been through a concerted action, combating the contagion rather than getting into certain issue on which the nation had a consensus. I think we had achieved a point in 2009 and 2010, where after a long time, the 7th NFC award in 2009 provided some kind of a relief to the smaller provinces. Let me quote you the example of Balochistan. This was signed in Balochistan when the formula, I think, and Punjab gave sacrifice, that when you have weightage of population to 82% and poverty and backwardness to 10%, revenue generation to 5%, and inverse population density to 2.7%, with the result that share of revenue of Balochistan jumped from 5.11 to 9.9%. So that was I think, a sense of achievement that these federating units, my view is that a strong basic federation is strong federating units means strong federation and not the other way around. Wherever we have unfortunately tried to centralize the authority in Islamabad, we have unfortunately gone wrong. First of all, let me take you back to 1960 or earlier, when Sikandar Mirza declared one unit, and then the local bodies elections in which Nawab Murray and Mangal got elected. It was not liked by Ayub Khan, and he sacked them, and the insurgency of 1960s onwards started. Now, 1973 constitution, the consensus was developed by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto when the Baloch leadership agreed on the issue of provincial autonomy. And this was the consensus building point of view in which the Ataullah Mangal's government was constituted and formed, and we had near consensus, this constitution, which of course Salman Akram Raja Sahab will throw more light on. But the concept of federalism has always been sabotaged, in my view and experience, from centralist Islamabad-focused people, because let's be frank, armed forces are a central organization. The police services are not. We are devolved, we basically work for provinces, we are recruited by the center, but we work in the provinces, and other way around. So therefore, the whole concept of centralizing power and authority has undermined the very concept of federalism in Pakistan, and that we have paid a very heavy price. And I thought, although not perfect, 18th Amendment has missed certain points. Some of the aspects which should have been attended, but most of them were covered, and we went back to the original spirit of 1973. So that, Musharraf, I think, is where civil servants, bureaucracy, and establishment or the centralizing forces have always ditched the provinces and haven't even let the local government system develop. So in my view, 2009 and 2010 were points of satisfaction for this nation where consensus was built and we could have moved on. There is no point to open this chapter again. There is a provision within this 18th constitutional amendment through Council of Common Interest and other where the issues can be resolved. We can discuss those, whether health related, education related. Yes, look at Balochistan in 1990. They passed a law that primary education in Balochistan will be Brahui, Balochi, and Pashto. 5 classes. Assembly passing a bill in 1990, and in 1992, Taj Jamali's government, PML and government, and they just removed this provision and brought back Urdu as a national distinct. Otherwise, this was so important. If the provinces, in the context of education and other areas, we can talk about health issues also, because before this NFC, we had this 0.5% of the GDP was spent on health. After this NFC and after this 18th constitutional amendment, the provinces have gone on to 1.1% of GDP, which is still not much, but at least now the provinces are playing their role, and let them be encouraged rather than being discouraged, Musharraf.
That's very helpful, Tariq Saab, and as always, incredibly skilled. I will try to provoke you once again in a short while, but let me first, you mentioned Balochistan, and I think any debate or discussion about federalism merits a special, really a special chapter on Balochistan. We're lucky to have Rafiullah with us. So Rafiullah, let me bring the conversation to you. I mean, you are in Balochistan and you are serving the provincial government. One of the key points of debate or discussion that we tend to hear when it comes to federalism is that the provinces don't have capacity. And to an extent, even though you know me personally to be a federalist, I have to say that there is an element of truth to this. There are capacity limitations across different provinces. In fact, the fact that you've been drafted into the Balochistan government, I think, is very encouraging and a sign that that is being bridged. To what extent do you find that argument is useful in sustaining the centralized civil service aspect of our governance, which is the one aspect of national life in which there has not been any devolution? Rafi?
Thank you very much, Musharraf sir, for inviting me to this august and distinguished panel. I understand that there are 2 aspects to this debate. The first is that the argument that the 18th Amendment has gone too far and it has probably weakened the federation. And the second argument is that the provinces lack the capacity to implement or execute the powers that have been devolved to them. So I'll briefly speak about both. As far as the first argument is concerned, from a strictly academic perspective, there is a lot of comparative politics literature on decentralized federalism and its impact on managing ethnic diversity. The evidence is mixed, but if we go into the details of that academic evidence, the truth is that in ethnically divided countries, federalism has been a very effective tool of conflict and diversity management. All the evidence against federalism as a conflict regulating tool is from countries or is by scholars who have studied post-communist regimes where the institution of federalism coexisted with strong authoritarian form of government. So in other words, federalism, the only evidence against decentralized federalism is in countries where ethnic diversity was imposed through a top-down, where the federal model on ethnic diversity was imposed through a top-down authoritarian model. So in other words, it was where democracy did not exist or where federalism coexisted with authoritarianism. Other than post-communist regimes, almost all literature available out there indicates that federalism has been an effective tool in managing ethnic diversity. and that separatist movements are often the product of refusal to federalize rather than federalism itself. A professor of University of Oxford has conducted a study. She has studied federal models and separatist movements in more than 40 countries. And her single biggest finding is that no violent separatist movement has ever succeeded in a federal democracy. No violent separatist movement has ever succeeded in a federal democracy. So federalism and democracy go hand in hand. So I just wanted to bring this up with regards to the argument that it has weakened the federation. Coming to the capacity point, to begin with, I do acknowledge, I think, yes, there are serious capacity issues at the provincial level. But in order to come up with an informed debate and judgment on the capacity of provinces, we will have to compare it with something, the situation before 18th Amendment. And if we, which means that we have to compare that the weak capacity of provinces with their weak capacity, are they doing a better job than the federal government was doing before the 18th Amendment, or a worse job? So there are some indicators in this regard. And when it comes to capacity, again, we have to look at two things. First is the intent, the policy priorities and policy recognition, and the other is the capacity to implement those policy priorities. So as far as Balochistan is concerned, and Balochistan is probably the weakest of all the provinces in terms of capacity, I'll start with policy priorities. I think there is a strong indication, there is a strong evidence that the provincial government, or post 18th Amendment, the political leadership of the province has increased its, have demonstrated increased prioritization towards social sectors such as health and education. The indicator or the evidence in support of this argument is the resource allocation to health and education post 18th Amendment. I think that has significantly increased, with the exception of few years. In most provinces, let's say the education budget has hovered around 20% of the total provincial budget. So in terms of policy priorities, we have seen an increased prioritization of health and education sectors. Now we come to the capacity part. Yes, I admit there are serious capacity constraints, but I think it needs to be properly investigated and researched. But based on my personal experience, I don't think one can confidently argue that the federal government was doing a better job than the provinces. I think there are indications where provinces have improved service delivery. I'll quote two specific examples. One is the revenue collection, GST on services. All provinces have demonstrated that they have improved the collection. Provincial revenue collection has improved significantly, and they are doing a much better job than the federal government was doing when GST on services was with the federal government. I'll come to education. You have been doing tremendous work on education for the last at least a decade, as far as I remember. Balochistan, there is strong evidence that Balochistan has introduced some very important reforms in the education service delivery post 18th Amendment. I think because of lack of data, we yet do not, we are unable to quantify the impact of those reforms. I think maybe 5 years, 10 years down the road, we will see the impact of those reforms. So I do see that the provinces, I acknowledge that they have capacity constraints, but I don't believe that they are doing a worse job than the federal government was doing. I think that despite their limitations, they are still doing a better job than the federal government was doing with regards to smaller provinces before the 18th Amendment.
That's a fascinating response, Rafi, for many reasons. I mean, principally for how thorough it was, but I also think it sets up Miftah Ismail a little bit because if it is indeed true that the provinces are more efficient raisers of revenue and more effective spenders of money, then this whole debate, which really at some level isn't really about the 18th Amendment at all. If it is, it's only marginally. It's really about the National Finance Commission and the distribution of resources between the center and the provinces and amongst the provinces. Dr. Ismail, you had a series of tweets recently that was one of the triggers for us wanting to organize this conversation. Maybe start with that thread of tweets, which we'll feature on the screen as well. while you're speaking, and then maybe walk us through what your own position is on federalism writ large, on the 18th Amendment, and specifically on the National Finance Commission.
Thank you, Musharraf. First of all, let me just say that I agree with much of what has been said by Khosa Saab and Kakar Saab and Dr. Mullah. And in particular, I agree with Dr. Mullah that this is really not the time to debate an amendment, even or a constitutional change. While we are in the middle of a pandemic, I think that the priority should be to fight that COVID-19 and not worry about amendments to the Constitution, which we can definitely debate and undertake next year. So that's the first point. So this is really an unfortunate timing to talk about this. Secondly, I think that when the government people talk about 18th Amendment, they talk about undoing the 18th Amendment. I think that they really don't know what they're talking about, and they're really confusing the issue. I'll break down, the 18th Amendment, if I understand correctly, and Salman, of course, is a constitutional expert, so he'll tell us more, I think made 60 changes in the Constitution.
63, I think it was. Yeah.
63, okay. So let's divide this into three aspects. One was to strengthen the federation, what we've talked about so far, mostly. One was to shift power from the president towards the parliament and the prime minister. And if I'm correct, I think General Zia-ul Haq's name was also part of the Constitution, and the 18th Amendment has finally taken his name out of the Constitution. The third aspect was where the 18th Amendment said that whatever was decided in the 7th NFC award, which was in 2009, that the provincial shares given in the NFC cannot be reduced. And of course, in the 1973 Constitution, there was a concurrent list that people talked about, that this would be done away with in 10 years. That was never done away with, and it did away with that concurrent list. And it has given powers to the provinces. Now you can debate whether these powers were right or wrong, but I think there's a unanimous, almost a unanimous consensus in Pakistan that those are rightly to be given to provinces. I think there's a lot of support in at least the economic literature about why power should be delegated to the provinces and then to the local government. I think the provinces have really messed up one thing really badly. And that is that they've not really lived up to the spirit of the 18th Amendment, and whereas they have been very happy to grab power from the federal government as well as get money from the federal government, but they have not shown the same capacity to then delegate powers to the local government or to give money to the local governments. In Punjab right now, they've actually done away with the elected local government. I mean, there was actually an elected body. In Sindh, the People's Party has basically taken away all the teeth out of the local government power, so that the Karachi local government has essentially no powers. So whereas the provinces and provincial governments talk a good game about federalism, they're not really living up to their own talk. They're not walking the talk because they're actually not then developing the power. And so when Kakar Saab says that separatist movements are never don't ever thrive where there is federalism, so the true federalism really here it means, and especially in Sindh, for instance, there's a big Urdu speaking, Sindhi speaking divide or rural urban divide. There is actually no devolution of power. Similarly, we've been talking about a Saraiki province for I think many years now, and certainly around every election we talk about Saraiki province, but again there's not been a significant devolution of power to the Saraiki speaking area. I remember during last PTI term in Parvez Khattak's chief ministership in KP, there was a significant difference in spending patterns, and where in districts where, for instance, Maulana Fazlur Rahman was doing well, or PML Lahan had done well in the Hazara speaking district, there was not as much spending. I don't remember the name of the district, so I won't really name them, but there was significantly more spending in some of the districts where the PTI was doing well, which is fine, which happens everywhere in the world. I mean, there's some obviously politics to decision-making and resource allocation. But I'm just saying that the provinces have not lived up to devaluation of power to the local level. And had they done this, they would have entrenched federalism more in Pakistan. They would have entrenched 18th Amendment. And now, frankly, no matter what PTI says or anybody says, 18th Amendment cannot be done away with. It will not be done away with. Okay, it cannot be done away with. It's part of it, like you said, 63 places the Constitution has been changed by this. But the question is, and the problem is with fiscal issues. What happened was that when you gave 57.5% of the money to the provinces, and plus you have to, plus the federal government has to give 1% extra to KP for war and terror, 0.67% of the divisible pool to Sindh for doing away with Okra in the 1990s, and then also have to give money to GB, Gilgit-Baltistan, Azad Kashmir, and as well as to Islamabad Capital Territory. So you basically give away 62% of the money to the provinces. Now, even if you were to quadruple the federal resources, okay, so if you were to take the tax revenue from 4,000 billion rupees to 16,000 billion rupees, you will still not be able to balance the budget. That's how precarious the federation numbers are right now, because you have about 7,000 to 8,000 rupees, 7,000 to 8,000 billion rupees worth of expenses the federation has to undertake every year, besides giving the money to the provinces. So even if they were to make 16,000 billion rupees in revenue, they'll still, they'll still run short of financing their entire expenses. So something has to give, or something has to be done. Now, let me also just say that by changing the rules and giving less to the provinces, you will still not be able to balance the budget, not at all, because the federal budget is actually a consolidation of the surpluses of the provinces and the deficit of the federation. In fact, last year when the budget deficit was 8.9%, it was actually helped by some surpluses from the provinces. Had not, but for the surpluses in the provinces, the federation would have actually had a larger deficit. Well, what would happen if you change some of the shares? What would happen is that provinces will feel compelled to raise their own revenues. And again, if you look at the economics literature about federation, when you transfer responsibility, when you transfer authority, and when you give them money, when you give them, for instance, authority on spending money on education, spending money on health, etc., there has to be some transfer of responsibility. So I think that there has to be a discussion on this, a long-term discussion, a very long discussion. And two or three things come to my mind about what the discussion should be around. Number one, some taxes are in the domain of the federation, and some taxes are in the domain of the provinces. For instance, sales tax on goods is on the domain of the federation, and sales tax on services is on the domain of the provinces. This is exactly the opposite scheme compared to what there is in India, where the sales tax on good is in the domain of provinces, and sales tax on services is in the domain of the federation. So one could be a rejigging or reclassification of the domains of the provinces and the federation, of what taxes the provinces should have and what taxes the federation should have, and you have to figure out how to raise revenues for both provinces and federation. There is no doubt that the provinces will need to raise more revenues in the years to come. I agree with Mr. Kakar that there may be limitations to the provincial government's capacity, but they have been doing better than what they had done in the past. And in any case, the answer to a lack of capacity or a shortage of capacity or a limitation of capacity in Balochistan or Sindh or Punjab or wherever is not to take away the federal powers, it's to actually help them. There's nothing stopping the federal government from sending 10, the senior officials in Balochistan to help them, and in fact, I know that FBR does still, I think, raise some revenues on behalf of Balochistan, and then transfers that money after a small cut back to Balochistan. So this argument about capacity, I think, holds no water. Let me just say this: that in the last 10 years, since 9 years since the federation, and this is the numbers that I've been given by advisor to the current Prime Minister, and some greater verification needs to be done, but it's by a very seasoned man who's told me that since the passage of the NFC award, the provincial government's workforce has increased by 19%, but their wage bill has increased by 1,400%. 1,400%. So so there are issues there. There are issues about, and certainly if you're going to transfer all this power and money to the federation, to the provinces, you can ask them to raise some revenues, and you can also shift some responsibility. So I think that there is need to a discussion about these issues, about the fiscal issues surrounding this. But I think that there has to be a serious long-term discussion. But now is not the time. And the way PTI is going about this, calling it Kala Kanun and all that, that is not the way to do it. And the provinces, for their part, must devolve power to the local government. Otherwise, there is no. Otherwise, they have no moral high ground on which they can demand power for themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Ismail. I mean, I think there's a lot in your response to unpack, and especially on the fiscal side, where the burden should lie, what the thinking was when the original design in terms of for example, the sales tax on goods versus the sales tax on services. It would be interesting and useful to parse through some of those. But we don't want to go too far down the weeds because there are other aspects of the 18th Amendment that I think merit some discussion and debate. Salman Akram Raja Sahab, you've been a very keen, not just observer and commentator, but I would say a participant in our recent legal history, our recent constitutional history. And obviously, I know that you have very well thought out and considered views on the 18th Amendment writ large. I wanted to pose one aspect of the 18th Amendment to you that I have a problem with. And my own position is, I think the 18th Amendment, just like Dr. Arfana Mallah said, I think it is the silver bullet for the survival and the thriving of this country as a multi-ethnic, multinational state. The one aspect of the 18th Amendment that I have a problem with is how political parties were allowed to become individual and or family fiefdoms because of the particularity and specificity of the floor crossing rule. And what this did is it centralized power in the chairperson of the party in a way that gave them almost unlimited power over a party. Is that an unfair and deliberately skewed reading, do you reckon, of the 18th Amendment? Or is that aspect, I want you to comment on that aspect and obviously respond to the various viewpoints that you've heard so far, Salman. And let me unmute you before you start speaking. There you go, Salman.
Okay, Musharraf, thank you for that lead-in. Actually, what the 18th Amendment did by way of its anti-floor crossing provision is not extraordinary if you place it in the context of constitutions in the region. If you look at India, for instance, India has a far harsher provision in their constitution as regards the compulsion that can be placed on members of parliament with respect to their voting. Now, what the 18th Amendment says, Article 63A, is that there are three issues essentially: a money bill, a constitutional amendment, and a vote of confidence against the Prime Minister, on which you have to follow the party direction if there is a party direction. Other than that, members are free to vote as they please. Now, in India, any matter can be subjected to a whip. So in India, members can be directed to vote provided the central party leadership wants them to vote a certain way. So it's not extraordinary what happened with the 18th Amendment in 2010 compared to India. It's a very soft anti-flow crossing provision. So I really am not too perturbed about that. Because if in a vote of confidence, if you're going to vote against your own party, that's generally unusual. And the fact that it's now been put down in black and white maybe does not add much to what was already the case. Similarly, with the passage of the budget or a money bill, again, if you're not going to pass your government's budget, then that means you want your government not to function. So if you're the member of a ruling party or of a coalition that's in power, you are generally expected to vote in favor of the budget that your government is seeking to pass. So that's not particularly draconian either. The only real issue where one could say things have gone a little far is on constitutional amendments. But again, constitutional amendments don't happen every day. It's a rare event. So I would not be too concerned about the anti-floor crossing amendments brought in by the 18th Amendment. And if you look at the Indian provision, you will be genuinely shocked at what can be done to an Indian member of parliament. And their constitution and their democracy till recently had done reasonably well. So I'll put that to aside. The real issue really seems to me what you pointed to, your observations to begin with, and in response to one of the presentations, that maybe it's not about the 18th Amendment as a whole that we have a problem, or whoever has a problem has that problem. It is not the principle of devolution or the principle of subsidiarity that is really, bothersome. It's really the financial side of things. And it really comes down to the NFC award and the provision in the 18th Amendment that the share of the provinces cannot be reduced below 57.5%, whatever it was with the then prevailing NFC award. It can only be enhanced, cannot be reduced. It comes down really, to my mind, to that. Before I come back to this, there were one or two other issues which came up in the last few years. For instance, the 18th Amendment has devolved health to the provinces. An issue arose whether you can now have a common medicine or a drug registration authority. Is every province going to have its own drugs registration law and its own drugs registration authority? Or are you going to still have a central unified drug regulatory authority of Pakistan? Because obviously Pakistan is a customs union internally. There are no borders between the provinces. So a medicine that is allowed by one province will travel all across the country and will be available elsewhere. So this was a legitimate, genuine need. And our federalism worked beautifully. All the provinces agreed in the constitution there is a power to devolve power upwards, to send power back to the center. And the provinces passed resolutions under Article 147, 146 of the constitution to say that on this subject, even though it now is a provincial subject, there may be federal legislation, and we're happy with there being federal standards and a federal regulatory authority. So nobody can really accuse the provinces of being intransigent or unreasonable. When the occasion has arisen, the provinces have risen to the occasion and have allowed the federation to function. So I really don't see too much of a problem with the devolution that the 18th Amendment brought in. The fact that the provinces have not further devolved onto the local governments is, I think, a blot on the provinces. But that, again, is no reason to undo the 18th Amendment. That simply is reason to urge the provinces to do better and to actually devolve power down to the local governments and have the local governments be responsible for issues that should legitimately fall within their domain. The issue really is with federal expenditures. Now, what happens with the 18th Amendment is that federal expenditures do not get devolved proportionately, even though some of the authority or much of the authority and most of the subjects do become solely provincial. The expenditure that has to be made with respect to two issues in particular, defense and debt servicing, remains a federal responsibility. Now, this becomes then not a question of principle as much as it becomes a question of balancing books. So we can keep the principles of the 18th Amendment to one side, and we can probably agree that there is really no real quarrel over those principles of devolution and subsidiarity. The problem is really more fiscal or financial. If somebody comes and tells me that, look, this is our minimum defense requirement, and whoever determines that requirement has competently done that, and that this is our minimum debt servicing requirement. We have national obligations to multilateral or bilateral creditors, and these obligations have to be discharged at the federal level, both the principal and the interest payments, and there simply isn't enough money available with the federation to meet these obligations. Then for me, it is no longer a question of constitutional or federal principle. It is simply a question of how do you pay for these matters. Defense has to be paid for, debts have to be serviced. So what do? Do you then go back to the provinces and ask them to have some kind of a constitutional convention whereby they agree voluntarily to give up part of their entitlement under the NFC award and say, all right, since the federation this year needs X 100 billion rupees more, we will let the federation have that money out of our entitlement, even though that will mean that we spend less on education or on health, or we give less to the local governments, but because this is a federal need, we will do so. So that could be one way of going about it, calling a Council of Common Interests meeting or otherwise a provincial convention, and getting the provinces to give up what is theirs by way of the NFC award. The other is, which is now, it seems, the preferred route, is to make the provision in the Constitution flexible all over again. The rigidity that has come into the Constitution, that there cannot be any deduction in what goes to the provinces, can that provision, or should that provision now once again be made flexible and handed over to the drafters of the NFC awards, that they decide from one award to the other what the ratio of the taxes being collected at the federal level is, that is to go to the provinces. So that, to my mind, is the real issue on which there can be a real argument, and there should be a real debate, and if necessary, a new dispensation. So the federal principle, I think, is strong, but there is a fiscal issue which needs to be dealt with. There is a financial bookkeeping, book balancing issue which needs to be dealt with. And if that is a situation, then the provinces and the nation needs to be taken in confidence, and there is no need to attack the 18th Amendment generally as a Kala Kanun or whatever. Let us be honest about it. What is the real issue? Who has a problem as a matter of principle with the provinces having power to provide healthcare or provide education? Is that really an issue that is weakening the federation? I do not think so. So I think we are maybe skirting the real issue when we launch a large-scale omnibus attack on the 18th Amendment. The real issue seems to me to be debt servicing and defense. The money has to be provided for that, and we need to find an acceptable way forward, acceptable to the provinces and the federation, to raising the funds which are necessary for meeting these two expenditures.
That's a fascinating take, Rajasab. I think, let me, and I'll come back to you on this as well, but let me pose this to Dr. Mallah. I think that perhaps by making it an accounting problem, we're ignoring one vital aspect of this debate, which I think only then manifests, if we don't talk about it in this kind of a conversation, then it manifests itself, I think, in ugly ways and in other places. For example, I think that what Salman Akram Raja has posited is perfectly reasonable. We have a balancing the books issue. The books need to be balanced. Maybe the best way to do it is to ask the provinces nicely to cede some of their space or to be a little bit flexible. And there can be guarantees for future payments down the road. There can be fiscal arrangements. But in order to ask somebody to be nice, you have to be nice yourself. So much of the debate around the 18th Amendment, and especially around federalism, is laced with identity politics that is negative. And so when we attack people in terms of their identity, or when we say things that people see as an attack on them, then they are going to counterattack. And when you raise a national discourse in which there's attack and counterattack, attack, counterattack, then turning around and then saying, look, we're in a bit of a jam, could you be nice, becomes very difficult. How much do you think identity politics plays into the wider issue of federalism?
Actually, I'm very happy to listen all these speakers. Almost all are on same page that there is no problem with the 18th Amendment. And we all agreed that 18th Amendment is a constitutional amendment. It is not a sacred book. We can debate anytime, every time, and with clear intentions that where there is a problem. There are almost 60 amendments. We can't say that all these 60 amendments are black laws. Okay, problem is there in NFC award, then let us come and discuss about 8th NFC award. It is a time for 8th NFC award. And books needs to be balanced, but Federation also thinks about shed a little, Federation also has to think about its own size. As per 18th Amendment, they should have 5 ministries, 5 to 6 ministries. Why they have retained 22 ministries? That is an extra burden on the behalf of Federation. So I think all the provinces, all the government, federation and in the province should sit together and talk nicely about it, that exactly the problem is, where is the problem, and how to solve it. And I agree with you that there is a binary, and binary is always pain, other and us. It always create other, it always create hate, and we should avoid to create others, because we all are the citizens of Pakistan. There is no other for us. But unfortunately, when the debates is around the 18th Amendment, it's somehow to hit on the capacities of the province, as you yourself posed the questions, that there are the serious concerns about the capacities. Capacities about what? Capacities about Balochistan, capacity crisis about Balochistan, that Balochistan is not capable enough to handle their problems, are the capacities about Sindh. And when we talk about Sindh, we always quoted inverted Sindhis, the rural Sindhis. And the debate, always debates comes around the feudals, the Sindhis behave like this, blah, 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 blah. So the thing is that actually what is happening during these questions, the peoples living in the lesser provinces consider themselves that is, they are being patronized. This is the same mindset as we just are continuously, I can say that we are continuously engaged, that look, we are the equal citizens of this country. Don't treat us as others. Don't consider us that we are, the Balochis are less capable, or the Sindhis are less capable, because the federal civil services has a quota of every provinces. They compete from their provinces quota and they join the Federal Service Commissions. A person compete on the Balochistan quota, from the Punjab quota or Sindh quota, and they are the federal, make the Federal Public Service Commission, and they are the one who make the decision. I fail to understand that from where the capacity issue arises. The same civil servants, when sit in the Islamabad, we consider them more competent. If the same civil servant posted in Karachi or in Quetta, suddenly the issue of capacities arises in our mind. So these are actually the binaries which are just pushing us toward the identity issues, which are forcing us to react in our ethnic identities, in the frames, because somehow there are certain forces that is not happy that we overcome our identity crisis and interact with each other at some equal levels. That's why I personally feel somehow, because I also react on certain statements of the politicians, and I must admit that later on I can say that it should not a nice reaction. But this is how even academicians, politicians suddenly react when they see that somebody is pushing toward in a narrow tunnel, and they suddenly come out with such kind of a statement. So I personally feel that there is a problem of identity when the center governments, or whoever is a proponent of centralist government, is actually constructing a debate around certain questions, certain points, capacity points, intention points, the points that they are not capable to govern themselves, then the reactions automatically comes in the minds of the peoples living in those provinces, I feel.
Thank you. That's a very, I think, heartfelt and sincere and honest response, and I'm grateful that you shared that, Dr. Saiba. Khosa Sahab, one of the aspects here consistently that we have to deal with is this question of capacity. We've already had Rafiullah touch on it, Dr. Mallah's touched on it. I wanted to ask you to maybe talk a little bit in more specific detail about law enforcement as one example of a vital area that is very much a local and a provincial issue, but which oftentimes tends to be managed from the center. I think there's, of course, very valid reasons to have something like the FIA. Even the most sophisticated federal designs like Australia or Canada have, in Canada we have the RCMP, in Australia you have the federal police. But concurrently you have enormous control, at least it is assumed, that the center enjoys over law enforcement because of the central nature of the police service. And I don't mean to pick just on the police service, but we want to benefit from your experience and your insights. So we're asking about that specifically. Talk to me a little bit about your own experience and what your views are on whether or not this is the right balance currently, or if it could be improved, in what direction.
I think, as you know, that this subcontinent, the Police Act of 1861, was a central act, and it was adopted by the provinces. And so even the Government of India Act of 1935, and then eventually the Independence Act of 1947 recognized now police as a segment or a subject was included in list 2, which was the provincial legislative list. And the criminal law or procedures or evidence, as Salman Akram Raja Sahab would know, were part of list 3, which was the concurrent legislative list. Police Act of 1861 was replaced by Police Order 2002. Again, a central law with basically 5 features which were to be adopted by the provinces. And those features was depoliticized police, a democratic control, not political control, institutional means. Second was highly accountable police through independent police complaints authorities. Third was that if you post an IG, then give him authority, autonomy in his operations and administration. The fourth was specialization and investment. And fifth and most important was that police is a community service. It's not a force, it's not military. So from that point of view, as soon as this 2002 order was promulgated on 14th of August 2002, immediately a writ petition was filed in Lahore High Court. And Justice Tasaddaq Jilani of Lahore High Court then ruled that Police Order 2002 primarily is relatable to the enforcement of the criminal law and policing. So criminal law and policing were declared as federal subject, whereas law and order was a provincial domain. So it's a very, it's a balance which has to be struck between the federation and the provinces, and therefore it squarely fell within the concurrent list. It was not ultra vires of the Constitution. So this 18th Amendment, before this issue was raised, what happened was, after the promulgation of this amendment, Sindh went back to 1861 Act immediately through a notification. They said that, okay, this gives authority to the provinces, so we'll go back to 1861 Act. And Balochistan also followed suit in 2011. So these are the 2 provinces. Punjab stuck with the Police Order 2002. KP also managed to hold on to that, but Sindh and Balochistan parted ways and went back to 1861 Act. What happened was, in Balochistan, Justice Qazi Faiz Isa as Chief Justice ruled that executive magistracy under the 1861 Act cannot be restored. That's violative of the Constitution of separation of judiciary from executive. So he diluted that 1861 Act, and Sindh kept on persisting with 1861 Act until the civil society activated, and in A.D. Khaja case, and in 2017, the civil society went to the Sindh High Court on this issue, where the High Court ruled that the authority and autonomy and all those powers that IG should exercise in the context of law enforcement are his domain, and IG is posted with concurrence of federal and provincial government. Once he is posted, then his tenure should be honored. So that was the issue. And this case eventually has landed in January as decision taken by the Supreme Court now. In the context of now, it appears that I'm arguing in a court of law, but the fact is that the Supreme Court has judged in January 2019 and has declared that the police is currently subject to the legislative and executive competence of the Federation and the province in relation to the matters covered by Article 142B. and Article 240 of the Constitution. I can read out those, but Salman Akram knows, meaning thereby. Now, this is a central law promulgated by the provinces, and they can amend rules, they can make rules accordingly, like in 1861 Act. The rules were made in 1934 by Punjab and adopted by other provinces. So under this police order 2002, the rules have to be made by provinces. Local amendments can also be made. Sindh has very wisely in 2019 has adopted that and reverted to the police order of 2002 with amendments locally made. KP also has adopted in 2017 the police law of 2002 with more authority to the IG and other local accountability mechanisms. Punjab, unfortunately, has not enforced, where Chief Justice Mansoor Ali Shah took up this in public interest litigation and said that Punjab should at least put certain institutions like Accountability Independent Complaints Authority or Public Safety Commissions, which Punjab so far has not done. So therefore, this is the kind of balance. And the latest development is that now the Chief Justice of Islamabad High Court has finally taken notice as to why the police law of 2002 is not applicable in capital city, while it was legislated that as soon as the local government system is promulgated in Islamabad, the day that is done, the police order 2002 will become operative in Islamabad. The local government system has been revived. There is a mayor and everything, but police law does not stand introduced in Islamabad. So here we are, the kind of federation and the provinces fighting a battle or tussle over who to post on IGs. Their tenures, are so short, and they are, making like a Rolling Stones or something of that sort. So this is a very unfortunate thing. Everybody wants to grab authority. So the beauty of 18th Constitutional Amendment is that it has given 6 points in the context of law and order and policing, and have recognized that Parliament's legislative competence over Police Order 2002 was not excluded under the scope of Article 270A2, and there is an internal instrument also of coordination between provinces and the Federation worked out in the 18th Amendment. If there is any issue, it can be amicably sorted out between the provincial and the federal government. So the mechanism basically has been provided for in the 18th Constitutional Amendment, not only in the context of policing and law and order in legislation, but also in other matters of resources and finance, which we have discussed. If there is some kind of a dissension or different point of view, there is a provision within this 18th Constitutional Amendment to sort out those issues. So instead of data, the facts, we are unnecessarily fighting over authority, power, resources, and finances, as Salman Akram Raja Sahab and other speakers also spelled out. So the issue here is that we should all follow the Constitution, the spirit of it, the letter of it, and then the laws which are made. So therefore, rule of law requires that the governments have to give and take, have to be more magnanimous, and to abide by rule of law. So the government has been clearly defined for the first time in the 18th Constitutional Amendment. The government is the chief executive and the cabinet. So the responsibility is that of cabinet and the chief executive, whether in the province or in the federation. So therefore, the chief secretaries or section officers and others are not government. They are government functionaries. So therefore, this battle is over. This is the political leadership and political will, which is important if they want to see that the policing is done according to the constitutional parameters and also in accordance with the law. And the citizens' satisfaction will only be if the police comes up to the trust of that and if there is a proper accountability. We have not even raised the accountability institutions, and we are talking about the police being misusing its authority. There is corruption and other aspects. I agree, these are issues in the police, but they have to be sorted out through institutional mechanism, through democratic means, through understanding between the federation and the provinces, which is the essence of federalism, which is the essence of federating units and federation getting, and they're not even talking to each other. This is not the way. So therefore, the IG should be very carefully selected, once posted, and that should be given an authority and autonomy in the context of investigations, operations, and administration to do and deliver what is his function. So that's the kind of my argument is that let's follow the constitution and rule of law in this context of law and order and policing.
Thank you so much, Khosa Saab. I think that, again, sets it up beautifully because in a sense, the spirit of what you're saying kind of confirms and affirms the central thesis that Dr. Miftah Ismail shared with us a little bit earlier, where he says that essentially one of the challenges is that whilst the provinces are very happy to take, and we're talking about power right now, the financial conversation is, I think, a separate one, although it may mirror this one, but that's not what I'm speaking of. But they're not so happy to give when it comes to devolving power, and not just devolving vertically. So not just devolving power in terms of the chief executive and the cabinet giving power to districts and elected governments at the district level, but more interestingly, through the example that you just shared, also not so willing to give it functionally, so that, if they have an IG, the IG should be the master's voice. Now, Rafiullah, this problem, of course, is not unique to Sindh. I think it's popped up more in the Sindh case because Sindh is being governed by an opposition party, whereas the other provinces aren't. How do you see this playing out over a period of time in which we see 2 or 3 different permutations of governance? What if one day there was a single party majority government in Balochistan? What if that party was not in favor in Islamabad or in Rawalpindi for that matter? How do you think it would play out in terms of the assignment of positions like IG? And what is the solution to this? Because where I disagree with Khosa Saab is his optimism. So I don't think people are going to start getting along because it's in the Constitution. I think we have to find some other mechanism, and maybe it's too difficult a question, but I do want you to dilate on that, Rafi.
Thank you, Musharraf sir. First of all, I would just like to make a note of caution. I think we need to manage our expectations about the implementation of the 18th Amendment and the resolution of these issues that I think we would continue to face them probably for the next decade, I think. The 18th Amendment has fundamentally restructured the Constitution of Pakistan, many aspects of it. It took special representatives 40 years to get the 18th Amendment. If we start from 1973 Constitution, I think it will take us a lot of time for many of us to understand and truly absorb and implement the spirit of the 18th Amendment. So I think it's going to take some time. You have rightly pointed out some of the issues. Miftah have also highlighted the issue of lack of devolution to the local government tiers. I think provincial elites, they are very reluctant to sort of implement the spirit of the 18th Amendment within their provinces as well. But as a realist, I don't necessarily blame them. I think it's just, it's a question of time. We need to, for me, the takeaway from this is that we need to mobilize and empower the voices of the local governments, mobilize and empower the voices of other elements in the provinces, civil society and others, who can in turn put the pressure on provincial elites. So it's a journey that will take us some time, like it took us some time to get to the 18th Amendment. So to begin with this, I think we need to sort of manage our expectations. I would also like to comment on a very important point, Musharraf Sahab, you raised about the prospects of a single party coming into power into Balochistan. I think this is one of the really under-debated. This is, if you ask me, the biggest governance constraint, one of the biggest governance constraints in Balochistan is coalition politics. And coalition politics is again linked with federal design. Balochistan is a divided and fragmented polity for 2 reasons. A, ethnicity, and 2, tribalism. Tribalism is something that will eventually wane and fade with the expansion of higher education, urbanization, and these factors. We are expecting, and they already have weakened tribalism. But the The other structural constraint on service delivery, on governance in Balochistan is the ethnic divide, the Pashtun-Baloch divide, which has in turn resulted in coalition politics, which in turn has weakened service delivery. So when we compare the governance in Balochistan with Sindh or with Punjab, we are almost always comparing apples with oranges, because in Balochistan, for all practical purposes, you never have one chief minister. For all practical purposes, there are 5 to 6 chief ministers. The chief minister is chief minister with a thread, like only it's a question of 2 or 3 seats to sort of bring a vote of no confidence against the chief minister. So this changes the entire sort of the dynamics of politics in Balochistan. And I think this is one of the unfinished agenda of the 18th Amendment, that is redrawing of the provincial boundaries. The coalition politics, which is one of the biggest constraints of governance, is primarily because of the flawed provincial boundaries of Balochistan. Now, I'm saying this not from an identity politics perspective, but from a academic perspective. When ethnic groups live on their historical territories and are regionally segregated, it is okay. Evidence suggests us that it is okay to draw provinces along ethnic lines or along linguistic lines when they are living on their historical territory, when they are segregated. So in Balochistan, you can draw a clear line between the Pashtun and Baloch population. So there is clear regional segregation. Any party aspiring to come into power at the provincial level has absolutely no incentive to appeal to the other ethnicity, because the structural sort of realities are so stark that they do not have an incentive. And no wonder there is no party in Balochistan whose appeal transcends beyond ethnic boundaries. And as a result, we have this trap where we have coalition politics, and you cannot, and that has diluted accountability. So for example, if you blame a ruling party or if you want to hold them accountable, they will almost always begin with the concept of coalition politics, and to a great extent, rightly so, the chief minister or the ministers, they are so bound by these these constraints. So to conclude my point, I would like to stress that we need to manage our expectations about the way the 18th Amendment is implemented. There will be loopholes, there will be flaws, but it is going to take us some time. Two, in terms of specifically in terms of Balochistan, I would also like to point out that rather than doing away with the 18th Amendment, there is we need to work further, and I think talk about the unfinished agenda of the 18th Amendment. That was the redrawing of the provincial boundaries, or the creation of the issue of creation of new provinces. I think I understand it's a sensitive issue, but in Balochistan, there is a very strong case for the creation of a new province, not only to settle some of the ethnic disputes within the province, but also to facilitate the ground for smooth governance and service delivery.
Thank you, Rafi. I thank you for that response, because basically you've given us an agenda for the next 4 policy roundtables at Tabadlab. We're going to try and wrap those 4 up into the next 5 to 10 minutes as we bring it to a close. And I'm going to warn Dr. Ismail that we're going to ask him to close. So we'll come to you right at the end. And before we do that, maybe Raja Saab, I could ask you to comment on this idea of more provinces, because obviously I could really rile up every single member of the discussion right now just using let's call it the Rafiullah Kakar principle of new provinces. Punjab would be split at least 2 or 3 ways. KP would need to be split probably anywhere between 3 and 5 ways. And of course, Dr. Mallah will not be surprised to hear that, of course, Sindh would be on the chopping block as well. When we initiate these discussions, we often become victim, Raja Saab, to our fear of what will be provoked as a reaction. How do you propose we think about this in a coherent way so that we can apply singular principles across multiple contexts? I think to me at least, that seems like one of the most vexing aspects of the federal design, particularly for Pakistan.
I think we can build on what Kakar Sahab has said. He was very careful in saying that where an ethnic population is residing in its historic territory, their line drawing should not be problematic. Now, the historic territory concept for line drawing has been followed in India, for instance. They've made new provinces out of existing ones again and again, along linguistic lines and along the idea of the historic abode of a particular ethnicity. Now, that may be something. I'm not very familiar with the internal conversation in Balochistan. Would the ethnic Baloch or the Brahui population be okay if the Pashtun areas were carved out and turned into a separate province on the basis of the principle that Rafiullah Kakar has proposed, linguistic and historic abode? So if that is the case, then that would have to be determined on the ground through some kind of popular participation into the proposal before the proposal is actually put to vote. Is this a proposal that will be acceptable, or will it cause internal strife within the various provinces? So it's certainly something to look into. India has done it successfully. They divided Andhra Pradesh very recently, just a few years ago, into two separate states. So why not in Pakistan?
Sure, but one of the, sorry, just to add to this, I mean, there seems to be a wide-ranging universal consensus on a South Punjab province, whether it's called South Punjab, whether it's Bahawalpur, whether it's Saraikistan. Those are all debated. But there seems to be, for the last decade or so, widespread consensus. And yet, there's been no public participation per se. And more importantly, there's been almost zero progress along those lines. So what explains that inertia, or that absence of conversion of that potential energy into kinetic?
Well, I suppose there can be two reasons there. One, Lahore not wanting to give up power. So every province obviously has a provincial center at the moment. So there is obviously always an argument in favor of the status quo. Somebody is gaining from the existing arrangement. So a new province will take something away from the existing structure. So that could be one reason that clearly comes to mind. Why would Lahore, or for that matter, Quetta, or any of the provincial centers give up power? They're likely to hang on to it. But the other issue that comes to mind is the changes that would need to be made to our federal, dispensation within the constitution. How would we reorder the Senate, for instance? At the moment, the Senate has 100 members. Every province has the same representation, same number of senators. So if you turn, for instance, Punjab into 2 or 3 provinces, so you end up giving to what today is Punjab 3 times the representation in the Senate. So if the same principle were to be followed and 20 members were to be allowed to the new province of South Punjab or the new province of Bahawalpur, so where do you go? And so that would change the balance with the other provinces within the Senate. Will the other provinces continue to look at this 3-tiered erstwhile Punjab province, now turned into 3 provinces, with trepidation, or would they be comfortable with it? So if, for instance, Balochistan remains a single province with 20 members in the Senate, and Punjab suddenly has 60 members in the Senate because it's now been cut up 3 ways, would that be okay in terms of the national balance between the provinces? So that's a serious, I think, issue that needs to be taken into account. Sindh has its own problems, of course. In Sindh, while you may have a linguistic population concentrated in some urban areas, it would not pass Rafiullah Kakar's historic abode test. Is 70 years enough of history or not? I mean, these are questions which would then come up in the context of Sindh. So it is problematic, and it opens up questions of balance within the federal and the constitutional structure, which have to be very, very carefully touched. And the imbalance caused may have consequences that we don't want.
Thank you, Raja. Before I go to Dr. Ismail to wrap up, I did want to bring that.
Khosa.
Go ahead, Khosa Sahab.
Okay. I think what Rafiullah Kakar has just said has lots of weight in it. There is a need for more provinces. But having served in Balochistan, and I know that the power and authority of the Sardars or tribal chiefs have eroded over a period of time. There's an emergence of a middle class youth. Even the low-grade insurgency has got out of the hands of the Sardars, and a middle class top gold medalist is leading the Balochistan Liberation Front. So therefore, there is a need to empower the local people. We have continuously, in every election, it's my experience that we have manipulated. We have tried to sort of engineer, do political engineering in Balochistan to a certain extent. I know for sure that Pashtuns and Baloch can cooperate with each other and emerge for the context of in a proper democratic framework. They are willing to do that. There is lots of, they can accommodate each other's viewpoints. While on the ethnic basis, there is a case all over Pakistan for more provinces. But for Balochistan and other provinces, smaller provinces, there is a case that let us empower the local people. Let's hold fair and free election. So eventually it comes down to what Ghausbaksh Bizinjo said before Supreme Court. And these are few lines that he uttered before the Supreme Court. He said that you cannot create brotherhood by means of bayonets, butchery, death, and destruction. You cannot create a united nation by force. Nations have risen and come into being in historical processes by feelings of common interests, by voluntary unions, by recognition of each other's rights, by respect and brotherly love for one another. So that's the key. My dear, Pakistan has to survive. Let us honor and respect the sentiments of each other of people living in the federating units of Pakistan.
Thank you, Khosa Sahab. I wanted to bring the question of Sindh, of course, to Dr. Mallah as well before I went to our other Sindh representative, Dr. Ismail. Dr. Mallah, how complicated would a discussion about multiple provinces in Sindh really be? I suspect extremely complicated.
Yeah, not only Sindh, but overall Pakistan is very complicated because we, in the last 70 years, slowly, gradually, people learn to live with each other. There is a mass migration within provinces. How much more we will divide peoples on the basis of languages, ethnicities, and like this? Because we are already still facing the consequences of one partition and separation of Bengal. So I think right now, because if you are agreed to divide Balochistan on the historical lines, then the question of South Punjab comes, then the question of Hazara and Pakhtun comes, then the question of Urdu and Sindhi deviance comes. This will create and reinforce more binaries in every federating units. Right now, we all are more concerned about develop a consensus about the division of powers between federating units and Crown. One thing that I quickly want to mention here is that another unfinished agenda of 18th Amendment is that there is the constitution of Federal Constitution Court, which will decide the matters between federation and provincial units. So it must be, if it should be established, it will solve many constitutional problems between provinces and federation. Next, I personally feel in the Sindh, the issue of more provinces is very complicated because despite all hatred, despite all ethnic divides and bloodshed, right now, the Sindhis and Urdus and Pashtun and Punjabis have learned to accept and own each other and agreed to live in Sindh in a I can't say brotherly way because being a feminist, I say sisterly as well as in a brotherly way.
Well, on that note of fraternity, I bring it to you, Miftah Ismail. Maybe address some of the topics that we've talked about and wrap it up for us. How are we going to go forward? I leave you to solve the grand problem.
Thank you, Musharraf. First of all, I don't think there was a note of fraternity. I think there's a different word you want to use for that. She said that, we should be all together in sisterhood. And I blame Rafiullah Kakar for taking us away from the 18th Amendment all the way to now creation of new provinces. I mean, we started talking about, whether we want to restrict, rights of the provinces that already exist, to now whether we want to have more provinces. In all honesty, I mean, I've been in politics now for a few years, and I've talked to a lot of people, and I'm personally a proponent of more provinces in Pakistan. But I think that the only problem really, and the only discussion really, is between Karachi and the rest of Sindh. I think there is a large-scale consensus now for the need for a Saraiki province, whether it's one or two provinces. There can be a discussion about a Pothohar province. There is a discussion, and I think a healthy discussion, and a general agreement about dividing Balochistan in two, in Pakhtun and Baloch areas. And I think there can be a discussion about Hazara province in KP. And I think we should also empower GB at the same time, and perhaps, try and see if we can somehow come up with a constitutional trick where we can give some representation to the Kashmiris in our Senate, but also at the same time keep them a separate entity, unlike other provinces. The issue actually comes to Sindh, and again, Rafiullah is wise beyond his ears, and he came up with this formula about this, this historic thing. And so sort of, to placate the Sindhi-speaking population of Sindh, maybe the Karachi will not go away. But the fact is that Karachi actually was really never a Sindhi city, in the sense that, the very few Sindhis were living in Karachi, and Karachi was also part of Balochistan for some time. And then again, in the Talpurs brought them back to Sindh. But there is a lot of discussion. The problem is that, where are these provinces even viable if you make them small provinces? I mean, is Sindh really viable without Karachi if you take away all the base of, 90% of Sindh's revenue, for instance, come from Karachi and stuff like that. So these are seriously hard issues to address beyond ethnicity, and again, there should be no division, as Dr. Mallah has pointed out. I mean, of people on ethnicity, but there can be better administrative, units. And so there's nothing wrong with recognizing ethnicity or linguistic, nature of population as one aspect of it. There are people in Pakistan who say that we should have as many provinces as there are divisions in Pakistan, so that, then directly we are devolved, directly into a federation just by the basis of 18th Amendment. I think the problem in Sindh, for instance, and not just in Sindh, but in other provinces also, in Punjab, in KP, and in Balochistan, has been that the ethnic majority there has really not been forthcoming in sharing power with the ethnic minority, and this is true in all provinces. And this is human nature, of course. If I am, today in power, I'm very reluctant to share power. So that's my take on the provinces, but I think that at some point we need to discuss these provincial issues, because just as there are multiple ethnicities living in Pakistan, and we could not keep a one unit as we tried in the 60s. So I think that there are multiple ethnicities, geographically defined multiple ethnicities in Pakistan, and perhaps we should think about administrative units there, but we have to still make sure that all the provinces are then, financially viable. Coming back to the 18th Amendment, I think Salman Saab and Khosa Saab and Dr. Sahiba and Kakar, they've all actually said that there is really no discussion on going back on the 18th Amendment, going back on the provinces, the rights of the provinces, or the powers of the provinces. There are financial issues that we need to deal with, but let me again, repeat this, that the budget deficit in Pakistan is the deficit of the federal government plus surpluses of the provinces. So even if you were to rejig the NFC by itself, the total deficit will not go down. For that, you need to have more resources. Think about it this way. We have maybe about 14 to 15,000 billion rupees of expense in Pakistan. This is federal government, including debt servicing, defense, and everything, plus all the provincial expenses, okay? So you need to raise 15,000 billion rupees in taxes, whether it's raised by the provinces, whether it's raised by the federation or cities or whatnot. So we have to actually, when we next time think about this, we have to do all of that. We have to think about where and how revenues are raised, and then how are they divvied up so that all these books are balanced. There is no point in trying to balance the federal book and then not balancing the provincial books. In fact, we don't allow provinces to borrow, but if you change the NFC award, then the provinces will also go in deficit. So you have to think about that. Just one other thing that Salman Saab has said that I wanted to comment on, and again, very rightly he said that, this is a financial issue. But even if you change the 18th Amendment, tomorrow if you change the 18th Amendment and you take away that clause which says that you can revise the NFC award upwards or downwards, unless the next NFC award consensus is reached, nothing changes. So you still have to have an NFC award. And so that's why I tweeted also that the first thing that we should do is we go into the 8th NFC award and try and come up with a way where all the provinces sit together and come up with a consensus. And they've done this in the past. They've actually made, they've come up with 7 NFC awards. There's nothing stopping us from doing the 8th NFC award. And once we come up with an award, and then if we need to, think about amending the constitution, we should do this. And thinking about amending the constitution, we should not take this very lightly, So we should think about amending the constitution only after some sort of an agreement or at least a summary agreement has been reached at the NFC award about what to do about the financing. But really this has to be divorced from, talk show politics and people giving this the name of Kala Kanun and all that stuff. These are serious issues that affect the health and education that is being provided to the children of Pakistan. If you can take away the money from the provinces, what would happen to the health and education budget? So there are, so there are things that we need to think about. I want to just make one other comment about what Dr. Mallah said, and she was right. I think that she said this, that we should have reduced the size of the federal government after the 18th Amendment. And indeed, what happened is that, when the powers were shifted to the provinces, the federal government just came up with new names for the ministries. So rather than the Agriculture Ministry, now we call it the Food Security Ministry, or rather than the Education Ministry, Education Standards Ministry, the Environment Ministry is now called the Climate Change Ministry. So not much of a reduction in federal bureaucracy took place. But at the same time, let me also just say that the total expenses of the civilian government is only 500 billion rupees. So, and of which I think the salary is about half. So even if you fire all the entire federal government, then you'll still save 250 billion rupees. So really, the problems are more serious, and the problem really is of revenue. We need to raise revenue, but then we have to sort of sit together and figure out how provinces deficits are also met. And again, as a right of central politician, I'll tell you that the only way out of this is growth. You grow the economy by 10, 6, 8, 9%, and many of these problems will be solved. And unless you grow the economy, these problems will come back to haunt us. The reason right now we're talking about this is, and let me just now advertise our Muslim League's, we do apologies, our Muslim League's accomplishments, that somehow we were able to keep the deficit at a reasonable level. The most deficit was under my year at 6.5%. So good fiscal planning is also required, not just 18th Amendment, and the deficits now last year went to 8.9%. So there is something to be said about fiscal prudence as well. You cannot make big deficits and then blame the provinces and say that provinces are taking away all this money, because we've actually also done the same thing, and we've run deficits under 5% in one of the years. So it's possible, but very difficult. But this thing requires long-term conversation and very mature, non-emotional conversation about how to take Pakistan forward.
Thank you, Dr. Mallah. Thank you, Dr. Ismail. Thank you, Tariq Khosa Saab. Thank you, Rafiullah Kakar Saab. And very, very grateful to you, Salman Akram Raja Saab. I think ending on the note that Dr. Ismail did is very useful. 2 things that I take away from what he just said. 1, we have to sit together. And 2, this is really about revenue. Now, where the revenue will come from, whether it'll come from growth, is there any growth to be had in the next few years? What will the fiscal federalist design of this country be? How will tax collection improve when the economy is not growing? Are all questions for the future. So these serious discussions and debates, inshallah, will continue here on Tabadlab Policy Roundtables. Thank you for joining us once again, and look forward to seeing you again soon.